The rain pounded relentlessly against the car windows as Jonathan navigated the winding mountain roads. He squinted through the downpour, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. His destination, the Blackwood Hotel, promised a peaceful retreat from his stressful life in the city. But as he finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the imposing structure of the hotel loomed ahead, casting long shadows under the stormy sky. Jonathan parked his car and grabbed his suitcase, dashing through the rain to the front entrance. The grand, dark oak doors creaked open, revealing a vast, dimly lit lobby. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, its flickering lights casting eerie patterns on the walls. The reception desk, manned by a middle-aged woman with piercing blue eyes, stood at the far end of the room. She greeted him with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the Blackwood Hotel," she said, her voice soft but oddly cold. "May I have your name, please?" "Jonathan Reed," he replied, handing over his identification. She nodded, typing his details into an ancient computer. "Ah, yes, room 312. Here is your key." She handed him an old-fashioned brass key, attached to a heavy key ring. "Breakfast is served from 7 to 9 in the dining room. If you need anything, just call the front desk." Jonathan thanked her and headed towards the grand staircase. As he ascended, the creaking steps echoed through the silent lobby. The third floor was dimly lit, the thick carpet muffling his footsteps. He found his room at the end of the corridor, inserted the key, and pushed the door open. The room was spacious and elegantly furnished, with antique furniture and heavy drapes that added to the feeling of being transported back in time. A large window overlooked the dense forest surrounding the hotel, the trees swaying in the wind. Jonathan set his suitcase down and began to unpack, feeling the weight of his hectic city life slowly lift off his shoulders. As he settled in, he noticed a peculiar door at the far end of the hallway. Unlike the other doors, this one was old and weathered, with a heavy padlock securing it shut. Curiosity gnawed at him, but he dismissed it, assuming it was a storage room or a maintenance closet. After unpacking, Jonathan decided to explore the hotel. He wandered through the dimly lit hallways, admiring the antique decor and the sense of history that permeated the place. The few other guests he encountered were quiet and reserved, their conversations hushed as if not to disturb the silence. That evening, Jonathan dined alone in the grand dining room. The other guests sat at separate tables, their eyes avoiding his. The sense of isolation grew, and the silence of the hotel pressed down on him. He finished his meal quickly and returned to his room, hoping for a good night's sleep. As he lay in bed, the sound of the storm outside mingled with an odd, rhythmic tapping. At first, he thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but as he listened more intently, he realized it seemed to come from the locked room down the hall. The tapping was faint but persistent, like someone tapping their fingers on a wooden surface. Jonathan tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over his head, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Unable to sleep, he got up and walked to the door. The tapping ceased as he approached, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. He stared at the padlock, feeling a strange compulsion to open it. His hand reached out to touch the cold metal, but he pulled back at the last moment. Shaking his head, he forced himself to return to his room. As he lay back down, the tapping resumed, more insistent than before. He tossed and turned, sleep eluding him as the eerie rhythm echoed in his mind. By morning, Jonathan was exhausted. He splashed cold water on his face and tried to shake off the unsettling events of the night. Determined to enjoy his stay, he spent the day hiking through the surrounding forest, taking in the fresh air and the serene beauty of nature. But no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, his thoughts kept drifting back to the locked room. As the sun set and he returned to the hotel, a sense of foreboding settled over him. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. He glanced at the door once more before entering his room, the compulsion to open it stronger than ever. He knew he had to find out what was behind that door, but fear held him back. Little did he know, his curiosity would soon lead him down a dark and terrifying path. Morning arrived with an eerie stillness that seemed to seep into every corner of the hotel. Jonathan sat at the small wooden desk in his room, sipping a cup of bitter black coffee as he tried to focus on the day's plans. Despite the peaceful surroundings, the events of the previous night haunted him, the persistent tapping echoing in his mind. He decided to explore the nearby village, hoping the change of scenery would clear his head. The village was quaint, with cobblestone streets and old-fashioned shops that added to the charm of the area. He spent the morning wandering through antique stores and sipping coffee at a small cafe. Yet, despite the picturesque surroundings, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to him like a shadow. As the afternoon wore on, Jonathan found himself drawn back to the hotel. The mysterious locked room tugged at his thoughts, an unsolved puzzle that gnawed at his curiosity. He returned to his room and tried to distract himself with a book, but the words blurred on the page as his mind drifted back to the door at the end of the hallway. Dinner that evening was a lonely affair. The few guests at the hotel sat in silence, their faces cast in the dim light of the dining room's chandeliers. Jonathan picked at his food, his appetite lost to the growing obsession. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery against porcelain. He couldn't shake the feeling that the other guests were avoiding him, their eyes filled with something between pity and fear. Back in his room, the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent than ever. It felt as though the sound was burrowing into his brain, demanding his attention. Jonathan paced the room, his thoughts in turmoil. He knew he had to find out what was behind that door, even if it meant facing whatever secrets it held. The next day he decided to investigate the hotel's history. He approached the receptionist, the woman with piercing blue eyes who had checked him in. She seemed startled by his questions but maintained her composure. "Can you tell me anything about the history of this hotel?" Jonathan asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The receptionist's eyes flickered with something akin to fear before she answered. "The Blackwood Hotel has a long and storied history," she said, her tone guarded. "It was built in the late 19th century and has been a retreat for many guests seeking peace and quiet." "Has anything unusual ever happened here?" Jonathan pressed, sensing her reluctance. She hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing of significance, just the usual stories that come with any old building. Ghost tales, strange noises, that sort of thing." Jonathan thanked her and walked away, feeling more unsettled than ever. He spent the afternoon in the hotel's library, poring over old newspapers and records. He found nothing concrete, only vague mentions of disappearances and odd occurrences. The more he read, the more his obsession grew. That evening, as he prepared for another restless night, he overheard a hushed conversation between two elderly guests in the lounge. They spoke in fearful whispers, their eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. "Did you hear about the locked room?" one of them said, her voice trembling. "Yes," the other replied. "They say it's cursed. Every guest who stays near it ends up, well, you know." Jonathan's heart raced. He had to know more. He approached the guests, who fell silent as he neared. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I couldn't help but overhear. What do you know about the locked room?" The guests exchanged nervous glances. "You shouldn't ask about that," one of them whispered. "It's best to leave it alone." "But why?" Jonathan insisted. "What's behind the door?" They shook their heads, refusing to say more. Frustrated, Jonathan returned to his room. The tapping had become a relentless drumbeat, echoing through the walls. He couldn't take it any longer. Grabbing a small set of tools from his suitcase, he made his way to the locked door, the corridor silent and empty. His hands trembled as he knelt before the padlock. He inserted a small pick into the lock, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to hold its breath. After what felt like an eternity, the padlock clicked open. Jonathan took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with dust and decay. He stepped into the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Rows of photographs lined the walls, each one meticulously framed and labeled. His heart pounded as he moved closer, squinting to read the names and dates beneath each photograph. The faces stared back at him, frozen in expressions of fear and despair. Underneath each name was a cause of death. Drowned in the lake, fell from the rooftop, mysterious illness. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he recognized some of the names from the guest book he had signed upon arrival. The photographs continued around the room, each story more horrifying than the last. Jonathan felt a growing sense of dread as he realized the dates spanned decades, each victim meeting a tragic and untimely end during their stay at the hotel. As he scanned the room, his flashlight beam flickered over a more recent photograph. His blood turned to ice as he saw his own face staring back at him. Underneath the picture was his name and today's date. Panic surged through him as he stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere, he turned and fled the room, slamming the door behind him. The padlock clattered to the floor, but he was too shaken to care. He raced down the hallway, his mind racing with fear and confusion. How could his photograph be there? How could it be dated today? Back in his room, Jonathan tried to collect his thoughts. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. He paced back and forth, glancing nervously at the door. He knew he had to leave the hotel, but something held him back. It was as if the room itself was alive, watching and waiting. Jonathan's anxiety heightened as the hours crept by. His mind raced, replaying the moment he saw his own photograph in the locked room. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a sick prank, or maybe he had misunderstood. But deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. Unable to sleep, Jonathan decided to gather more information. He needed to understand the history of the hotel and its eerie secrets. He made his way to the hotel's library once more, hoping to find something that could explain the disturbing photographs. The library was a shadowy, quiet place filled with rows of dusty books and old records. Jonathan started by searching through guest ledgers, meticulously flipping through pages that chronicled years of visitors. He noticed that many of the names he saw in the locked room appeared in these ledgers, often with a short stay followed by a sudden absence. Next, he turned his attention to old newspaper clippings stored in yellowing folders. Most were mundane, announcements of local events, births, and deaths. But buried among them were articles about disappearances and mysterious deaths in the area, each incident seemingly linked to the hotel. Jonathan's hands trembled as he read one particular article from the 1950s. It detailed the disappearance of a young couple who had been staying at the Blackwood Hotel. They were last seen entering the hotel, and their belongings were found untouched in their room. The article mentioned rumors of a cursed room and hinted at dark secrets hidden within the hotel's walls. As he continued to read, Jonathan found more and more references to the hotel's sinister reputation. Tales of guests vanishing without a trace, whispers of ghostly apparitions, and unexplained accidents plagued the hotel's history. It seemed that everyone who came too close to uncovering the truth met a tragic end. One article, dated 20 years ago, caught his eye. It was an interview with a former hotel employee who claimed to have seen something terrible in the locked room. The employee described seeing photographs of guests with their causes of death written beneath them, just as Jonathan had seen. The interview ended abruptly, with the employee refusing to speak further and leaving the town shortly after. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. The stories were too similar to ignore. He was convinced that the photographs and the mysterious deaths were connected. Determined to find answers, he decided to confront the receptionist, hoping she could shed some light on the hotel's dark past. As he approached the reception desk, the woman with the piercing blue eyes looked up, her expression unreadable. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried to keep his voice steady. "I need to know more about the history of this hotel," he said, his tone firm. "Specifically about the locked room on the 3rd floor." The receptionist's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained silent. "I found something in that room," Jonathan continued. "Photographs of guests with their causes of death, including mine, dated today. What is going on here?" The receptionist's face remained impassive, but Jonathan could see a flicker of fear in her eyes. She glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in closer. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That room is not meant to be opened. It's a place where the past and present converge. The photographs, they're a record of what's to come." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. But why? Who put them there? And why is my photograph in that room? The receptionist shook her head. "I don't know. It's been like that for as long as I've worked here. The hotel, it has a life of its own. People come and go, but the room remains. It's as if the hotel chooses its victims." Jonathan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. "I need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. The receptionist's expression softened slightly. "It's not that simple. Once the hotel marks you, it's almost impossible to leave. The others, they tried." but they never made it far. The hotel always finds a way to bring them back. Desperation clawed at Jonathan's mind. There has to be a way, he insisted. I can't just stay here and wait to die. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. There might be one way. The caretaker. He's been here the longest. If anyone knows how to break the cycle, it's him. But he's a reclusive man. Hard to find, even harder to convince. Jonathan's hope flickered like a candle in the wind. Where can I find him? He's usually in the basement, she said quietly. But be careful. He's not entirely sane. With a mixture of fear and determination, Jonathan headed towards the basement. The air grew colder as he descended the narrow staircase, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The basement was dark and damp, filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. In the far corner, Jonathan saw a dim light and heard the faint sound of shuffling. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he rounded the corner, he saw an old man hunched over a table, sorting through a pile of photographs. The caretaker looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of madness and sorrow. "You've come," he said, his voice raspy. "I knew you would." Jonathan swallowed hard. "I need to know how to break the cycle, how to escape this place." The caretaker's eyes bore into Jonathan's. "There is no escape," he said softly. "The hotel has chosen you. You can run, you can hide, but it will find you. Just as it found me." Desperation clawed at Jonathan's mind. "There has to be a way," he insisted. "I can't just stay here and wait to die." The caretaker shook his head slowly. "The only way out is through sacrifice," he whispered. "A life for a life. But the hotel is never satisfied for long. It will always come back for more." Jonathan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Sacrifice? What do you mean?" The caretaker's eyes gleamed with a mad intensity. "You must give the hotel what it wants, a new victim to take your place. Only then will it let you go." Jonathan recoiled in horror. "You mean I have to kill someone?" The caretaker nodded slowly. "It's the only way. But remember, the hotel will never be truly satisfied. It will always come back. The cycle will continue long after we're gone." Jonathan's mind reeled with the weight of the caretaker's words. The thought of sacrificing another person to save himself was abhorrent, but the alternative was to face certain death. As he backed away, the caretaker's voice followed him. "Choose wisely," he said softly. "For the hotel always gets what it wants." Jonathan fled the basement, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and confusion. The hotel's oppressive silence seemed to press down on him as he returned to his room. The photograph of himself, dated today, loomed large in his mind. He knew he was running out of time. That night, the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent than ever. Jonathan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his predicament crushing him. He had to find a way out, but every path seemed to lead to darkness and despair. Jonathan spent the next morning in a daze, unable to eat or think clearly. The revelation from the caretaker haunted him, the words echoing in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. He knew he couldn't stay in the hotel any longer, but the prospect of sacrificing another person was unthinkable. He felt trapped, caught between his survival instinct and his moral compass. Desperation drove him to pack his belongings hastily. He would leave the hotel, run as far as he could, and hope the curse wouldn't follow. As he zipped up his suitcase, the photograph in the locked room flashed before his eyes, a grim reminder of his fate. Jonathan crept down the stairs, avoiding the gaze of other guests. The receptionist was at her desk, her piercing blue eyes following his every move. She said nothing, but her expression spoke volumes. It was as if she knew he was attempting the impossible. He exited the hotel and stepped into the crisp morning air. The village looked peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. Jonathan hurried down the cobblestone streets, his heart racing. He reached the outskirts of the village and continued walking, not daring to look back. The further he got from the hotel, the lighter he felt, as if shedding an invisible weight. Hours passed, and Jonathan found himself on a remote country road, surrounded by dense forest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the path. He paused to catch his breath, the silence of the forest enveloping him. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. As he resumed walking, a feeling of unease crept over him. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the only sound being the crunch of leaves underfoot. Suddenly he heard it, the faint rhythmic tapping he had come to dread. Jonathan froze, his blood turning to ice. The tapping grew louder, closer, as if it were chasing him. Panic surged through him, and he broke into a run, the tapping echoing in his ears. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. The forest closed in around him, the trees becoming a blur. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself to run faster, but the tapping kept pace, relentless and unyielding. Jonathan stumbled onto a clearing and collapsed to his knees, exhausted. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. He looked around, his eyes wide with fear. The clearing was empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. He tried to stand, but his legs were weak, and he fell back to the ground. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression. Jonathan recognized him as one of the hotel guests, a quiet man who kept to himself. The man approached, his eyes filled with an unsettling calm. "You can't escape," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "The hotel has claimed you." Jonathan shook his head, his mind racing. "No, there has to be a way out. I won't let it take me." The man stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You've been marked. Accept your fate, or the hotel will find you no matter where you go." Desperation gripped Jonathan's heart. "There must be another way. Please help me." The man sighed, his expression softening slightly. "There is only one way to break the curse. You must pass it on to someone else." Jonathan recoiled, the caretaker's words echoing in his mind. "I can't do that. I can't condemn someone else to this fate." The man's eyes hardened. "Then you'll never be free. The hotel will hunt you down, and you'll end up like the others." Jonathan felt a crushing sense of defeat. He knew the man was right. There was no escaping the curse without sacrificing another person. The weight of his predicament pressed down on him, and he felt his sanity slipping away. As night fell, Jonathan found himself wandering back to the village, his mind in a haze. The hotel loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette a constant reminder of his impending doom. He entered the lobby, the receptionist's eyes following him as he made his way to his room. He lay in bed, the tapping resuming its relentless rhythm. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and despair. He knew he had to make a choice, but every option led to darkness. Sleep eluded him, and he spent the night in a state of restless agony. The next morning, Jonathan knew what he had to do. He couldn't live with the guilt of sacrificing another person, but he couldn't escape the curse either. His mind was fractured, the weight of his fate too much to bear. He packed his belongings once more, knowing he was making his final journey. He climbed to the rooftop of the hotel, the cold wind biting at his skin. The village lay below, peaceful and unaware of the horrors within the hotel's walls. Jonathan stood at the edge, his heart pounding. He knew this was the only way to break free, to end the cycle of torment. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, the ground rushing up to meet him. The last thing he heard was the tapping, a final haunting echo of the curse that had claimed his soul. As darkness enveloped him, he felt a strange sense of peace, knowing his suffering was finally over. Jonathan's plunge from the rooftop was not the end he had hoped for. He awoke in a stark white room, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling his nostrils. Disoriented and groggy, he tried to sit up, only to find his arms restrained by soft leather straps. Panic surged through him as the reality of his situation sank in. He was in a psychiatric hospital. The room was devoid of personal touches, cold and clinical. The only sound was the distant hum of machinery and the occasional muffled voice from the hallway. Jonathan's mind raced, trying to piece together how he had ended up here. The last thing he remembered was stepping off the rooftop, embracing the release from his torment. A nurse entered the room, her expression one of professional detachment. She checked his vitals, made some notes on a clipboard, and left without a word. Jonathan's throat was dry, and he croaked out a request for water, but she didn't seem to hear him. Hours blurred together. Doctors came and went, each probing his mind with questions that seemed designed to confuse rather than help. They asked about his time at the Blackwood Hotel, but their interest was clinical, devoid of the urgency and terror he felt. Jonathan tried to explain the curse, the photographs, and the tapping, but his words were met with skepticism and condescension. They labeled his experiences as delusions, symptoms of a disturbed mind. He felt the weight of their disbelief crushing him, isolating him further in his despair. One day, a psychiatrist with kind eyes and a soft voice sat down beside his bed. She introduced herself as Dr. Evans and assured him that she was there to help. Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps she would believe him. He recounted everything: the locked room, the photographs, the caretaker's warning. Dr. Evans listened intently, nodding at intervals. When he finished, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Jonathan," she said softly, "I believe that you believe these things happened. Trauma can cause our minds to create elaborate scenarios to cope with the pain. But we need to focus on your recovery." Jonathan's hope dwindled. Even Dr. Evans, with her kindness, saw his ordeal as nothing more than a figment of his imagination. He felt a deep, consuming loneliness, as if the world had abandoned him to his fate.